Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that really gets people talking, often with these wild images in mind. China's social credit system. You've probably heard the stories, right? The single all-knowing score that dictates everything you do. Can you buy a train ticket? Where do your kids go to school? It sounds, well, pretty intense.
It does sound intense, and that's exactly why we need to dig into this, because those dramatic narratives, they're often quite far from the reality on the ground, which is much, much more complex. There's a really significant gap between that common perception and how it's actually implemented.
That's a key point. So for you listening, we're going to unpack this whole system. We've got a really solid stack of sources, academic research, official policy papers, even public opinion surveys from inside China. The goal here is really to peel back the layers.
Yeah, our mission today is pretty straightforward. Separate the facts from let's call it the fiction that's so widespread. We want to clarify what it really does, its true scope, and how it impacts not just individuals, but also, very importantly, businesses.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. When we talk about the social credit system, the SCS, what fundamentally is it? What's its core purpose?
At its heart, you should think of the SCS as this sprawling digital setup. Its main goal is to boost compliance with existing laws and regulations, both for people and organizations. It uses incentives, reputational ones, material ones, to sort of nudge everyone towards following the rules. It's what we call a socio-technical system, mixing social norms with digital tech.
Right. Now, this idea of trustworthiness or shengxin, is that something totally new for China, invented for this system? Or does it have older roots?
Oh, it definitely has deep roots. The SCS isn't appearing out of thin air. It's really an extension of social ranking and rating systems that have existed in China for a long time. Think about the hukou system, for example. That household registration controlling movement. Its modern form goes back to 1958. And then there's the Dingan. These are like lifelong personal files tracking performance, attitude. They follow you everywhere. So this idea of keeping detailed records on people, that's not new at all. It's been part of Chinese governance for decades.
So it's like a modern digital layer on these older ideas, which makes that 2014 planning outline sound really crucial. What did that document actually lay out? What was the vision?
It was absolutely the blueprint. That outline set some incredibly broad goals, things like creating laws for social credit, building a nationwide system for sharing credit info, developing supervision, even fostering a market for credit services, and, crucially, setting up ways to reward the trustworthy and punish the untrustworthy. The government's definition of credit here is super broad. It covers financial solvency, sure, but also honesty, keeping promises, general integrity. It's really ambitious.
That broad definition definitely goes way beyond just whether you pay your bills. So what are the main sort of pillars or categories they're focused on?
The sources point to three main areas. First, there's commercial trustworthiness, which is all about getting businesses to comply with rules, fight fraud, that sort of thing. Second is societal trustworthiness, aimed at promoting a more moral society, valuing honesty, hard work, family devotion. And third, there's government integrity. This actually applies the system to government officials and politicians themselves, trying to cut down on corruption and make them more accountable. So yeah, he's trying to cover a lot of ground.
That's such an important distinction because, like you said, the common view in the West is that this is all about controlling individuals, scoring every little thing they do. Is that really the main focus?
That's largely where the misconception lies. I mean, the system is meant to apply universally, but if you look at the actual policies, the focus has been overwhelmingly on companies. One analysis found something like 73% of the policy documents were aimed at the corporate sector. That's why you often hear it called the Corporate Social Credit System, or CSCS.
Right, the CSCS. So this idea of me as an individual having a score that goes up and down based on, I don't know, whether I jaywalked, that's not quite right.
The central government never actually planned for a single, all-encompassing score for citizens like that. It's true, some local areas like Rongcheng did experiment with really detailed personal scores, but Beijing stepped in pretty quickly and clarified things. They said you can't penalize someone just based on those local credit scores. Any penalty has to have a clear legal basis in existing laws or regulations. So those local experiments, they were sort of reined in.
Okay, that's a huge clarification. So if it's not this universal personal score, how do individuals get caught up in it? How does it affect regular people?
Mostly, individuals feel the impact through their roles in organizations, like as employees or representatives of a business. There are things like professional practice records for people in regulated jobs, civil servants, lawyers, finance workers. Sometimes credit records are used instead of criminal background checks for certain jobs. And yeah, some local governments do offer little perks, like credit points for discounts on medical care or tourist sites, but it's pretty inconsistent and more about small rewards than big punishments based on a score. And what about the government itself? You mentioned government integrity. Are agencies and officials actually subject to this too? Or absolutely. Government institutions aren't exempt. In fact, they got the second highest number of enforcement actions, something like 13% back in 2020. The idea is to improve government self-discipline, hold them accountable if they don't pay debts or default on contracts. It also covers social organizations, even foreign NGOs operating in China. They're part of the system too.
Okay, so if that single score idea is mostly myth, how does the system actually exert its influence? Because the sources really emphasize these blacklists and red lists. What are those exactly?
Right, the lists are key. Basically, blacklists are public lists identifying companies and individuals who've broken specific rules or regulations. They showcase the bad behavior. Red lists are the opposite. They publicly highlight entities that are compliant, performing well, the good actors, and these lists have been central to the whole system right from the start.
What sort of things land you on these lists? Is it minor stuff or serious violations?
It prioritizes violations of laws and industry regulations. A famous example is the Lalai blacklist. That's for people or companies who fail to comply with court orders, often about unpaid debts. On the positive side, you have things like the classy taxpayer red list for businesses with great tax records. But red lists also reward political and moral behavior, which goes beyond just strict legal compliance. That's an interesting aspect.
The sheer scale of these lists, it sounds enormous. What did the research find about how big and maybe adaptable this list system is?
It's pretty staggering. One study identified 273 distinct blacklists and 154 red lists just across the provincial level. That's a lot of lists. And what's really striking is how flexible it is. Take the COVID-19 pandemic. Almost immediately, new blacklists popped up, penalizing things like price gouging or spreading rumors, while new red lists rewarded contributions to fighting the virus. It shows how quickly it can pivot to national priorities.
That adaptability is really something, which makes you wonder about the data feeding all this. How much data are we talking about, and what kind is it?
The scale of data gathering is, well, enormous is the right word. For the corporate system, the CSCS files pull in government records and compliance data from at least 44 different state agencies. We usually divide the data into two types. There's public credit information, or PCI, that's generated by government bodies, things like court judgments, tax records, permits. Then there's market credit information, MCI, which comes from the market consumers, industry groups. But the MCI part is less developed, more supplementary right now. The PCI is the core.
And is all this data flowing into one massive central database somewhere?
The collection itself is decentralized. Different agencies, local governments collect their own data. But there's a platform called the National Credit Information Sharing Platform, or NCISP. The goal is to aggregate and share all that public credit information there. And the key piece linking it all together is the Unified Social Credit Identifier, the USCI. Almost every entity in China got one starting around 2015, like a unique ID number that connects all their different records across the system.
So once you end up on a blacklist, what happens? What are the actual practical consequences for a business or an individual?
That's where the unified rewards and punishments mechanism kicks in. And it has real teeth. If you're blacklisted, you can face restrictions on things like buying plane or high-speed train tickets, getting loans, winning government contracts, even holding certain jobs. On the flip side, if you're on a red list, you get perks. Things like faster administrative approvals, fewer inspections, maybe better loan terms. It's designed to create very tangible incentives and disincentives.
So just to be really clear, getting blacklisted isn't because your overall score dropped too low. It's because you violated a specific rule or law.
Exactly. Now, officials might have some discretion in how they pursue violations, but the criteria for getting put on a blacklist are generally predefined. And importantly, it's not necessarily a life sentence. You can usually get off a blacklist, typically after maybe 2 to 5 years, if you fulfill your legal obligations and fix the problem.
Huh.
There is an off-ramp.
Okay, let's hit the elephant in the room directly now, because this is where so much confusion comes from, that social credit score. Is there really a single number, like a FICO score, for every person and business in China controlling their lives?
Look, based on all the serious research and policy documents, the answer is definitively no. There is no single, Unify numerical score, not for businesses, not for individuals, that operates across the whole country, different platforms, different regions. They use different evaluation systems or ratings. And like we said, the central government actively discouraged those local attempts to create universal scores for citizens. It's honestly one of the biggest misconceptions out there.
So that image, the one that pops up in headlines, maybe from a Black Mirror episode, of the single number determining your fate, that's basically a myth.
It is largely a myth, yes, a significant misconception. The system's main engine has always been focused on corporate compliance, making sure businesses follow the law. The impact on individuals is often indirect, linked to their role in a company or through those specific local programs. Now, do numerical scores or grades exist anywhere? Yes. You might see like a 0-1,000 score in some specific pilot city like Rongcheng had, or the A to D tax grades the state tax administration gives businesses, but a universal personal score that follows you everywhere. That just doesn't exist nationally.
Got it. And what about the high-tech aspect? We hear about AI, facial recognition, big data powering this whole thing. Is it really that sophisticated right now, tracking every little thing?
Well, there's definitely ambition towards what they call algorithmic regulation, using big data, AI, for predicting risks, for early warning systems. That's the goal. But the current reality, especially for the corporate SES, is often less high-tech than portrayed. A lot of the core data, the public credit information, is still generated and manually entered by civil servants. We don't see direct real-time feeds from, say, facial recognition cameras on the street, or your social media posts, or your online shopping history pouring into your official CSCS file right now. Sure, some cities, like Hangzhou, are experimenting with city brain platforms that might integrate SCS data for things like deciding on subsidies, but that kind of comprehensive, real-time, AI-driven scoring based on all that data, it's not the widespread reality today. It's more aspiration than current operation across the board.
That's really interesting. So flipping the perspective, what do people inside China actually think about all this? It must be quite different from the often dystopian view we get outside the country.
Yeah, the surveys show a much more nuanced picture. While Western media often focuses on the negatives, quite a few Chinese citizens are actually, well, okay with certain kinds of surveillance, as one study put it. They often support including things like bad behavior on the subway or domestic violence or spreading harmful rumors online within the scope of the system. So it's not automatic rejection, it's more conditional.
That is surprising, but what about the punishments? Is there strong public support for really harsh penalties tied to the system?
Generally, no. The surveys suggest citizens don't favor harsh punishments. There's less support for things that directly impact your social network, like public shaming in your neighborhood. And there's strong opposition to things like blocking kids from private schools based on parents' actions, possibly due to historical sensitivities about collective punishment. But interestingly, there is very high support for disqualifying people with low SCS standing from government jobs. They seem to hold public servants to a higher standard in this regard.
And here's a really unexpected finding from the research. What about members of the Chinese Communist Party itself? What are their views?
It's quite counterintuitive, actually. Surveys indicate that CCP members are often less likely to support surveillance and punishment through these state-run SCS systems than ordinary citizens are, which suggests that support for these kinds of social controls in China, while broad, isn't unconditional. It's not just a top-down imposition without any variation in opinion, even within the party.
Okay, so given all this complexity, is the Chinese SES really one of a kind? Or are there systems in other parts of the world that are comparable? People often jump to Western credit scores.
That comparison comes up a lot. And there's some validity to it. I mean, look at FICO scores in the U.S. A low FICO score can have just as serious consequences, right? It affects your ability to get loans, mortgages, sometimes even rent an apartment or get insurance. So systems that assess your trustworthiness or creditworthiness and have real-world impacts, they're definitely not unique to China.
Are there other examples, other countries using big data or trust metrics in similar ways?
Sure. You can look at Australia's good character test for visas failing that can get you deported, or their welfare system requiring weekly check-ins. In Germany, you have the Air-Schufa score affecting lungs and housing, and some health insurers use fitness tracker data to adjust premiums. India's Aadhaar system links biometric data to a unique ID for accessing services. And don't forget the private sector Uber ratings, Airbnb reviews. These absolutely function as reputation systems that control access to services. They're everywhere now.
That's a really useful perspective. So if these kinds of systems exist elsewhere, what makes the Chinese SCS stand out? What's the key difference?
I think the crucial differences are the sheer scope and the overarching government goal. Western systems tend to focus narrowly financial credit, compliance with a specific contract, platform rules. The Chinese SCS aims much broader, integrating legal, commercial, social, even moral dimensions of behavior. And critically, it's a state-led project with the explicit goal of strengthening compliance with all laws and regulations across the entire society. That enormous scale, the level of attempted government data centralization via the USCI and NCISP, that gives the state a potential governance tool unlike anything else we see globally right now.
So where's the system today? You said it's evolving. Is it fully baked or still under construction?
It's definitely operational, but it's still very much in a, let's say, foundational stage. It's evolving fast. There's no date at which the system will be suddenly switched on everywhere, fully formed. It's much more about incremental expansion, refinement, connecting different pieces, probably over the next decade or more. Think of it as a massive ongoing construction project.
And what are the current priorities? What direction are policies heading in now?
Recent documents really emphasize standardization, making sure credit information reporting is consistent across different places and sectors. There's also a push for more social credit legislation, though interestingly, early drafts of a national law got criticized as being too vague, maybe even redundant with existing laws. And the focus remains very strong on corporate compliance on the CSCS. That seems to be where the main energy is going, making that system more robust and effective.
What about the risks? Especially for, say, foreign companies doing business in China, should they be worried?
Well, there's no hard evidence right now of the system being used to explicitly discriminate against foreign firms just because they're foreign. But the CSCS absolutely does strengthen the enforcement of Chinese laws and regulations, and those might conflict with the foreign company's home country values or policies. So the compliance burden definitely increases. A specific risk is how personnel files get linked. The social credit record of a company's legal representative or other key managers can be tied to the company's overall record. So if an individual gets sanctioned, it can directly harm the business. And, there's always the risk of regulatory bias. Even with data, human inspectors still have considerable discretion in how they apply the rules. And then there's this looming issue of algorithmic accountability. As they try to use more AI to help make regulatory decisions, how do you check if the algorithm is fair? How do you appeal a decision made by a black box, essentially? Especially in contexts like China's, where data privacy norms are quite different. Prioritizing state access over individual control, that's a really tricky area for any company.
Thinking bigger picture geopolitically, could this SCS system actually start to influence things like global finance? Maybe challenge the big Western credit rating agencies?
That's definitely a possibility being discussed. Some Chinese economists are floating the idea of using the SCS's compliance data, not just financial data, to build a whole new Chinese model for credit ratings. The argument is that this could challenge the dominance of agencies like S&P, Moody's, Fitch, which are often seen in China as having a Western bias. It's potentially an attempt to reshape how financial trust is measured globally based on a broader definition of credit.
And the million-dollar question for many outside China, are they trying to export this model? Could we see social credit systems popping up elsewhere?
There isn't like an official state policy saying, let's export the SCS. But some thinkers in China definitely see potential global advantages. Look, the underlying problems the SCS tries to address, lack of trust in markets, weak regulatory enforcement, those are global issues, right? So while the exact data China collects is unique to its context, the algorithms they develop for predicting regulatory risk, those could definitely be attractive to other countries looking for tech solutions to governance problems. It might be less about exporting the whole system and more about exporting the underlying tech and philosophy, potentially leading to a sort of Chinese-influenced model for smart city regulation or data-driven governance.
So for countries like the US or others in the West, looking at this with maybe some concern, what's the main takeaway? What should they be thinking about?
I think it really underscores the need for democratic societies to get serious about developing their own effective, efficient, data-driven governance models. But crucially, models that are built firmly on democratic values, transparency, rule of law, and robust data privacy protections. The risk is that if democracies don't innovate in this space, authoritarian models might seem more appealing simply because they appear more efficient, creating a vacuum. It's about finding that balance.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, the clear message is that China's social credit system is way more complicated, more fragmented, and frankly, less monolithic than the popular narrative often suggests. It's not one score, it's a whole evolving ecosystem.
Exactly. It's this huge ongoing experiment in using digital tools for governance, layered on top of traditional compliance methods. Its final form and long-term impact. That's still very much unfolding. We're watching it develop in real time.
And maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. As societies everywhere become more digital, not just in China, we're all generating more data. How does that inevitably lead to new forms of tracking, rating, and social management, even if they look different from China's system?
Right. The specific tools might vary, but those fundamental questions about trust, compliance, freedom, and privacy in a world saturated with information, those are becoming universal challenges that demand our constant attention wherever we live.
Thank you for joining us for this really fascinating deep dive.